My story begins with this ship, the USS Houston, which was the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet prior to World War II. It also had another distinction in that it was President Roosevelt's favorite ship. He had made 4 world cruises aboard the USS Houston. As flagship of the Asiatic Fleet, we were home ported in Manila in the Philippine Islands. On December 1st, just a week before Pearl Harbor was attacked, we got word to leave Manila suddenly, and we proceeded south to the island of Panay and the port city of Iloilo. On the morning that Pearl Harbor was attacked, we left the port of Iloilo, and we were on our way out of the harbor when the Japanese bombed the town and the harbor. They announced to the world at that time that they had sunk the USS Houston. As a matter of fact, they reported so many times after that that they sunk the Houston that we became known as the Galloping Ghost of the Java coast. We proceeded out of the Philippines and went south down through the South China Sea and to the island of Java. And for the next several months, we operated out of the island of Java and between Java and Australia, which is approximately 1,200 miles southeast of Java. At that time, our main objective was to convoy material and manpower in an attempt to build up the defenses of Australia. Around February 4th, we were operating in the Flores Sea just northeast of Java, and we were attacked by 49 Japanese heavy aircraft, and they managed to hit us with one 500-pound bomb, which totally destroyed our after turret and killed all 55 men in that turret. And from that time on, we were totally defenseless for 180 degrees around the after part of the ship. Around the middle of February, we were ordered to take a convoy from Port Darwin, Australia, to the island of Timor, which lies between Australia and Java, to reinforce that island against the Japanese invasion. We got halfway there when again we were attacked by a large number of Japanese aircraft, and we were ordered to return to Darwin with the convoy. This photograph is the last photograph taken of the USS Houston before she was sunk, and it shows us in Darwin Harbor, having seen the convoy safely at anchor, and we turned around and immediately headed north back up to Java. The following morning, after this photograph was taken, Port Darwin was attacked by a great number of Japanese aircraft, and they totally destroyed the town and sunk every ship in the harbor, including those in this photograph, including the USS Perry, which you see directly behind the Houston. This has become known to historians as Australia's Pearl Harbor. In the meantime, the Houston headed north and proceeded to the port city of Surabaya, which is on the northeastern tip of the island of Java. There we were to join a fleet which was hastily being put together under the command of a Dutch admiral. The purpose of this fleet was to attempt to stop or at least slow down the Japanese advance towards Java and eventually Australia. We did know that there was one fleet proceeding between Borneo and Sumatra in the South China Sea, and there was another fleet in the Makassar Straits on the other side of Borneo, both converging towards Surabaya and Java. For the last 7 to 10 days of our existence, we operated out of Surabaya with this fleet which had been put together. The fleet was doomed from its very beginning because we had no common battle plans. We had never operated together. We had a language barrier. However, we were the only thing that was there available to attempt to fight the Japanese. So all of these ships from England and Australia and the Netherlands and America went out to find the Japanese. We operated out of Surabaya Harbor, and we would go out into the Java Sea each evening at dusk, look for the Japanese, and not finding them, we would return to Surabaya in the daytime. We would tie up to a dock and the Japanese would bomb us all day long. So for the last 7 or 10 days, we had virtually no sleep and no hot meals, just an occasional ham sandwich or a cup of coffee. Finally, on February 27th, we left Surabaya as usual, went out into the Java Sea, and came back the following morning, but we never entered the harbor before we got word that the Japanese had been sighted around WWII Island, just north of Surabaya. We turned around and immediately went out to sea, and we found the Japanese fleet around WWII Island. There followed an 8-hour naval battle during which the superior, better equipped, more modern Japanese Navy managed to practically obliterate our fleet. As a matter of fact, 13 major ships of our fleet were sunk in that 8-hour battle. Late in the evening, the Houston and the Perth, an Australian light cruiser, were ordered to disengage the enemy and proceed to the western end of the island of Java to the city of Jakarta. And there we were to refuel and then transit the Sunda Straits between Sumatra and Java and make our way to Australia and possibly home to much-needed rest and repairs. So our morale was very high when we arrived in Jakarta late that morning. But when we went to refuel, we discovered that the Dutch had already evacuated, and we sent some of our men ashore and managed to jury-rig some hose and get a little bit of fuel. In the meantime, we sent out Dutch reconnaissance planes to scour the area for the possibility of Japanese naval activity. They reported back that there were no Japanese within 10 steaming hours, or about 250 miles. So that afternoon when we left Jakarta, we were very confident that we were going to make it to Sunda and possibly home. So we proceeded west out of Jakarta towards that little bay at the very western tip of the island, a place called Bantam Bay. As we approached Bantam Bay, we ran into a group of Fubuki-class Japanese destroyers. So much for the reconnaissance not spotting any Japanese. We engaged into a running battle with the destroyers, and we turned down into Bantam Bay, and there we found 55 transports already unloading troops invading the island of Java. Realizing that we needed open water to maneuver, our captains took us out into the open sea. And as we reached the open sea, we found waiting for us 4 cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 destroyers, and an unknown number of torpedo boats. At about 5 minutes after midnight on the morning of March the 1st of 1942, the Perth took her 4th torpedo and she sunk. The Houston continued on for another 40 or 45 minutes until we took our 4th torpedo, and we lie dead in the water, out of ammunition, and with the Japanese forming a semicircle around us and turning searchlights on us and blasting us out of the water bit by bit. My battle station at that time was in number 1 turret. However, I was in the powder magazines, which are as far below the water as you can get. There were 13 of us down there, and when the word came to abandon ship, we made our way up to the main deck and started to go up to the forecastle where we were to abandon ship. A torpedo hit in the area where we were, and I was knocked unconscious, and when I came to, I could not find the other 12 men, and to this very day I've never seen any of them. I made my way up to the forecastle and eventually decided to get off the ship as it was going under, and I got into the water and I started swimming towards Java, which I knew was about 12 miles away on the horizon. I swam all that night, and sometime early in the morning I heard a lot of screaming and machine gun fire, and I realized that the Japanese were machine gunning the survivors in the water. I was approached a short time later by a torpedo boat who turned its searchlights on me, and I kept waiting for the bullets to come. I tried to feint being dead. I bobbed up and down in the water. They came up to me, and I could hear them speaking Japanese on the boat, and they poked me with a boat hook, and I kept waiting for the bullets, which never came, and finally they turned the lights off and sped away. I made my way almost into the shore by the middle of the next day, and at that point I was picked up by a Japanese landing barge and I became a prisoner of war. I had just turned 18 years old, and I found myself into an entirely new life. We were taken to a prison camp in Jakarta, from whence we began the day before, and we were there for 3 or 4 months when we were told we were going to take a sea voyage. And we were loaded on to small 800-ton inter-island steamships and loaded into the holds, and thousands of us jammed into these small holes without food or water, and we proceeded up to Singapore on the southern tip of Malaya. There we rested for a week, and we were put back on another ship, and we went up through the Andaman Sea on up to Rangoon, Burma, and there we found that the Japanese were going to use us to build a railroad, which has since become famous as the Burma-Thailand Death Railway, and it was the subject of the movie The Bridge on the River Kwai. This is a close-up of the area that I'm speaking about. There was a 250-mile stretch of jungle from a point about 90 kilometers northwest of Bangkok on up through Thailand and up into Burma to a place just outside of Moulmein, Burma. And that's where they were bringing us to build this railroad. They brought 61,000 Allied prisoners of war from Malaya and Java and Singapore, and brought us up to work on both sides of that railroad. They also conscripted well over 150,000 native workers, Tamils and Thais and Burmans, and brought them up to work on the railroad. These are some photographs taken of the railroad after its construction. We had no modern equipment whatever. We had no bulldozers or backhoes. It was just a question of taking hundreds of thousands of human beings and using them as slave labor and overpowering the land by these large numbers of human beings. The very first day that we arrived in Burma, the Japanese stood us at parade and told us that they needed this railroad for their war effort and that they intended to build it over the body of the white man. And that's exactly what they proceeded to do. Japanese engineers were asked about building the railroad, and they said that they could do it and it would take 5 to 7 years. Imperial headquarters gave them 18 months. Well, the railroad was completed in 15 months. But the price that it took to build 250 miles of railroad in 15 months was absolutely beyond imagination. At the end of the 15 months, of the 61,000 Allied prisoners of war that were brought up there, there were 16 to 18,000 lying in graves alongside of the track. Of the 150,000 native workers that were brought up, to this very day, less than 30,000 have been accounted for. So well over 100,000 people were murdered building 250 miles of railroad. This is one of the bridges that we built along the railroad. The bridge on the River Kwai was just one of 43 such bridges. All in all, we moved 4 million meters of dirt, 3 million meters of rock, and built 14 kilometers of bridging. This is all local teak wood coming out of the jungle. For the first couple of months, things were not critical. However, as malnutrition set in from the lack of diet, we were only issued less than a pint of rice per man per day. And as the malnutrition set in and our body weight dropped tremendously, everybody ended up weighing approximately 80 to 85 pounds within the first 6 months. As that occurred, our resistance to the diseases that we would encounter broke down, and we were soon to feel the effects of malaria, beriberi, dysentery, pellagra, typhoid, and a lot of other very fancy-sounding diseases. As the men became more and more ill, And as the death rate started to climb very rapidly, less and less men obviously were available for work, and the Japanese became frantic. And they became more and more brutal and more sadistic, and the beatings increased, and the screaming increased, and the rations were cut. They had a policy whereby sick men were not given full rations, and we had to keep spreading our meager rice rations out to keep some of the men alive. As I say, the beatings became more and more severe, and it just became an existence of day by day working 20, 24 hours, 30 hours at a time, with the Japanese screaming and hollering and beating, and this group of 80-pound human beings just trying to live day by day. This is a photograph of one of the camps in Thailand. All of the camps looked alike. They were all built exactly the same. The huts were built out of bamboo and adap, which is the dried leaves of the palm trees. And we built the framing of the structures out of bamboo and then covered everything with adap. Not very good material, and when the monsoons hit, which lasted 5 months out of the year, during which time it rained steadily for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the adap wasn't much good, and we found ourselves constantly soaking wet and lying in water and sitting in mud and eating in rain, and it got to be a horrendous nightmare. The huts were, as I say, all alike, and down the center of each hut was a dirt aisle, and on each side of that aisle was a platform about 3 feet high, made out of pieces of bamboo tied together with jungle vines, and those were our sleeping quarters. Each man was allocated 36 inches to lie down on. This is a photograph of a camp just after the monsoons have stopped and the mud is starting to turn back into dirt. The Japanese issued us no clothing whatever during that period. The only thing they gave us was a piece of cotton with a string on it, which we tied around our waist. And as you see in this photograph, this is the only clothing that we had during that period of time. One of the things that bothered us the most, besides the dysentery, were tropical ulcers. This is a photograph taken inside of one of the huts, and it would be a typical picture. As I said, everybody was down to about 80 or 85 pounds. Tropical ulcers are an insidious disease that occur when you cut yourself, and we were always working in sharp rock or sharp bamboo, and when you cut yourself, the sore became infected and festered and grew, and without any medication at all, which is exactly what we got, nothing at all, these sores just spread, and I've seen men crawling around in the dirt with nothing but bone from their knee to their ankle. Eventually the doctors decided that they would have to do some amputations to try to keep the men alive. And of course, by the time they did that, the man was down to about 70 or 75 pounds. And one other problem was that they had no anesthesia or any operating equipment. So they did the first amputations without anesthesia and using a hacksaw and a pair of pliers that we stole off the Japanese. These are 4 men who somehow or other managed to survive that horrible ordeal. As you can see, they're all smiling, and that's the one thing that bothered the Japanese the most. They did not want us to smile. They thought we should have committed harikari rather than be captured, that we were the lowest form of human being, and that we had no right to live, and we had no right to be happy. So whenever they saw any of us smiling, which was a common occurrence when the Australians and Americans got together, they became frantic, and they would beat us all up and disperse us when they saw this. This is a photograph of a bridge that I worked on in Burma. It has just been destroyed by the British Lancaster in the upper right-hand portion of the picture. As you can see by this photograph, the jungle that we worked in was extremely thick and totally inhospitable. There were no native villages, and it was just a disease-ridden jungle, which up until that point, nobody bothered even going into much. When the railroad was finished at the end of the 15 months, the prisoners were, or the survivors, were brought out in these steel cars. These cars probably could hold 6 or 8 natives comfortably, and they packed 55 of us in each one and locked the doors, and we sat on the siding for 5 days in the tropical heat before we even moved. The men were packed in so tightly that at the end of the journey, when we opened up the doors finally, some of the men in the middle had died, and they were just kept standing up by the pressure of being packed in there. We were taken to the camp at the bridge on the River Kwai, which you see in this photograph in its beginning stages. Bridge on the River Kwai was built by British and Australian and Dutch prisoners of war, and it became famous by the movie. This is what the bridge looked like at the end of its construction. We're looking towards Burma, where my group was working beyond those mountain peaks. The bridge was not destroyed, as is commonly thought, by William Holden and Alec Guinness struggling over a plunger to blow it up. Instead, it was destroyed by 37 missions by American and British aircraft flying out of India. This is a photograph the day that the bridge was finally hit and destroyed. This is a photograph taken just after it was destroyed. And that's what it looked like after the bombers finally knocked it down. This is what the bridge on the River Kwai looks like today. It's a very peaceful scene. It's a very famous tourist attraction, especially with Japanese. They're very proud of the fact that they built this 250 miles of railroad, which they were told would take 7 years to do, and they did it in 15 months. They're very proud of that fact, but the only thing that they omit is that they don't tell the world how they did it, that they murdered 100,000 people in 15 months building it, that they starved and maimed and beat and allowed to let die many hundreds of very fine people. After the railroad was finished, I was in a group that was on its way to Japan, and I got as far as Saigon, French Indochina, and there I stayed for the next 2 years, and I finished out my almost 4 years as a Japanese prisoner of war. And I was liberated on September the 6th, 1945, on my 22nd birthday.